One of the features that has changed the most from previous versions of macOS to macOS Ventura is how you access system settings. In fact, even the name has changed. If you go to the Apple menu here and you look, you'll see System Settings now. Previously, it had been called System Preferences. If you select this or access the System Settings app any other way, you'll come up with system settings that looks a lot like how they look on the iPad and on the iPhone now. So a complete overhaul from how it looked in previous versions when it was called System Preferences. Now you see a left sidebar that gives you access to the different categories, and then things will appear here in a list for whatever you have selected. And this will actually scroll. So you can actually have more things here than fit in the space. So it always starts on appearance, and this more or less corresponds to the general settings before in System Preferences, except that now General will actually give you a whole bunch of subcategories matching how it looks on the iPad and iPhone. So in Appearance you can see a variety of different controls, and notice how they are linear now from top to bottom. So you have appearance, accent color, highlight color, and all of that. You don't have a setting maybe on the left and one on the right. It's all just straight up and down now. And how you change any of these really depends on the particular setting. For instance, this is a bunch of different buttons that you could select. Change the accent color. This is 3 different icons, and you can click to select which one you want. This is a little pop-up menu. This is a switch, and notice how the switches, instead of checkboxes, they look a lot like the switches in iOS and iPad OS. Here are some radio buttons. So basically you look for whatever you want here on the left and then access the settings here on the right. Some of these correspond to how it was before in System Preferences, while others are very different. So, for instance, to access displays, there's a category here called Displays. It corresponds to what we had in System Preferences for displays. And then you have the same settings here. They're just now in a vertical list instead of being in various different formats and having panels and such. You still have buttons down here where you can access advanced settings for some things. And you can find a lot of different things moved to other places. For instance, in General now, a lot of things here would have had their own separate System Preferences panel before, but now they've been grouped under General. This keeps this list from getting too long. So Time Machine, for instance, is now grouped right there. To help with this transition, you can always use search. For instance, how to adjust the size of the pointer. You could search for pointer and it will come up with different sections that have access to that. So you can jump into accessibility, for instance, and then maybe even deeper into accessibility to find different things that have to do with the pointer. To give you a general idea how these work, let's use the sound section here. So in sound you can set an alert sound. So this is what happens when you try to do something and you can't take that action. You get an alert sound of some sort, and you could pick from a drop-down menu what sound you want. You can click here to preview the sound. You can select where to play the alert sound. So if you have multiple speakers, you can select there. You can select the alert volume as well. Whether a startup sound is played, that's just a switch. Whether user interface sound effects are played at all is a switch. And whether or not you get volume feedback when you adjust the volume, that's a switch as well. You also can choose inputs and outputs here. So for output, I can choose which one I want. There's a bunch of AirPlay devices here. On other Macs you may have, for instance, the headphones hooked up to speakers and also the internal speakers. And also input, you may have different microphones. And you can select the input level here. So you can switch between these. And here's where you set the output volume if you want to do it here rather than just using another method. And you can balance left and right. So you can see how everything having to do with sound is really contained here underneath sound. And then you just have this nice list that you can scroll through. The new list format for system settings is nice because it means Apple can add more settings. So they can add more sound settings here. Previously it would have meant redesigning how the sound preferences looked, but now they can just keep adding more to the bottom, which hopefully means we'll get more customization in the future. Another one to check out is to go down to trackpad. And here is where you can set things for the trackpad and determine how it works. So for instance, what happens to force a secondary click, which is usually called a right click or bringing up a context menu. So you can have it click or tap with 2 fingers. You can use the bottom right corner or the bottom left corner for that, or just have it off completely. But then you also have other gestures here that you can control. If you go to scroll and zoom, you can turn things like smart zoom, zoom in and out, natural scrolling, and rotating with 2 fingers on or off. And then more gestures here, and there's a list of those. For keyboard, this is where you'll find settings for the keyboard repeat rate, keyboard brightness. If you have a backlight for the keyboard, like on MacBooks, you can determine what happens when you press the FN or globe key, for instance. You can set touch bar settings if you have a Mac with a touch bar. You can go here. This is where keyboard shortcuts is now located. So you can create your own keyboard shortcuts. For instance, under app shortcuts. This all corresponds to how it looked before in system preferences, but it's a little bit different. It's a little different how you access it through this button here. You can also set your input sources. So if you have a different keyboard, you can edit that here. This is where you also find dictation settings and all the things that were in the keyboard before you now have here. So it's kind of similar. Whereas in other cases, like under General, for instance, software update or about or changing date and time, preferences or language and region, that's all now under General, not as its own top level category. Other things have moved up to their own category. So for instance, wallpaper is now its own category here on the left, and this just allows you to change your desktop wallpaper. It's similar to how it worked before. You can choose a dynamic desktop here. You can choose a light and dark desktop, a desktop picture. You can choose a custom color. You can add a folder to this list and pick a folder to choose images from. You can add a photo album from your Photos app library. And you could drag and drop just as before, just to this preview right here. So I can drag an image right there if I want to make it my desktop background without having to use all of this. And screensaver now is its own top level category as well. It's all the same functionality here. It's just not grouped together like they were before. Desktop and dock gives you access to controlling how the dock looks, but also things about the menu bar, like whether or not the menu bar is hidden. So you can hide the menu bar. So in full screen only, on desktop only, always or never hide it. So before there were 2 separate settings to get these 4 different options, whether or not it was hidden for regular desktops and whether or not it was hidden for full screen apps. In general, you're going to find all of the settings that you had in System Preferences. They'll all be here in System Settings, but they may be in different locations. For instance, here's Mission Control. It's under Desktop and Dock now instead of its own category. So if you're used to using System Preferences a lot and now you've upgraded to Ventura, it really pays to take the time to go through each one of these and check to see where things are now. Get familiar with it, especially if you use something like, for instance, the Mission Control settings. Knowing that they're under Desktop and Dock can save you a lot of time. And then here's that Hot Corners button that normally would be under Mission Control, but now you find it under Desktop and Dock since Mission Control is there. Here's another way things have been reorganized. There's now a lock screen category here. So you'll find things pertaining to the lock screen. Before, these were scattered to a few different places. And then remember, you're going to find most of the settings for dealing with iCloud under Apple ID here. So go to your Apple ID, and this is where you deal with that, and you have iCloud right there. And this is where you deal with your iCloud storage and which features of iCloud you're using and which ones you're not. Notice there's still a lot of inconsistency of how to get to things. For instance, to get to iCloud, you have to go to Apple ID, and then you have this control here, which takes you there. To get to your sound output, you would have to go to Sound, and then you have to choose one of these 2 tabs here for a section like that. And then to get to say changing keyboard shortcuts, you have to go to keyboard and then you have to click a button, and that button takes you to the control for setting and customizing keyboard shortcuts. So still a lot of different ways to navigate in here. It's far from unified right now, but at least it's a step in the right direction as we don't have two completely different things. System preferences on the Mac and settings on the iPhone and iPad.